Hi, I'm Sabrina. I'm going to explain what endocannabinoids and CB1 receptors are and how they cause hunger or the munchies after marijuana consumption. This is a neuron, also known as a brain cell. Everything you do relies on neurons communicating with other neurons. The basic structure of a neuron consists of dendrites, which do the listening, the soma, which contains organelles, the axon, which carries messages down its length, and the axon terminal, which is where the synapse is located. The synapse does the talking. Neurons talk with each other via action potentials indicated by the red peak, which are essentially signals that travel down the axon to affect the axon terminal. There are two types of synapses: inhibitory, which decrease the chance of an action potential occurring in the postsynaptic cell, and excitatory, which increases the chance of an action potential occurring in the postsynaptic cell. And just to clarify, the cell that does the talking is the presynaptic cell, and the cell that receives the message is the postsynaptic cell. When an action potential reaches the axon terminal, it causes the neuron to release chemicals called neurotransmitters shown by the green dots. These chemicals diffuse across the synaptic cleft, which is just the space between the synapse of the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. Then the neurotransmitters bind to the receptors located on that postsynaptic neuron to trigger an action potential in that cell. The cycle continues until the information reaches its destination. Let's look at the whole brain. There are two main parts of the brain that we will be focusing on: the hypothalamus, which is responsible for appetite, and the mesolimbic structures, which holds the pleasure center. What are cannabinoids? They are a type of neurotransmitter, and your body naturally produces them, which is what the endo stands for. Marijuana is also a source of cannabinoids because its active ingredient is THC, which stands for tetrahydrocannabinol. The receptors that bind cannabinoids are called CB1 receptors, and the CB stands for cannabinoids. These CB1 receptors are found all over the brain and the presynaptic cell and are unique because they work with endocannabinoids in a backwards way. What does this mean? Typically, the neurotransmitters diffuse from the presynaptic cell to bind to the receptors in the postsynaptic cell, while endocannabinoids are made in the postsynaptic cell and diffuse backwards to bind onto the receptors in the presynaptic cell. In this diagram, you can see different types of cells and their synapses. The ones highlighted in green indicate that they're excitatory, and the ones highlighted in red are inhibitory. So what happens when you are not hungry or haven't consumed THC? Your body will not produce endocannabinoids, so therefore the feedback fibers from your brain will fire action potentials onto the granule cells. Then the inhibitory granule cells will fire onto the mitral cells, which will partially inhibit them. These partially inhibited mitral cells will fire lower rates of action potentials onto the olfactory tract, which will provide inhibitory signals to the hypothalamus and your pleasure center. This is why food doesn't taste as good when you aren't hungry. What happens when you are hungry or have consumed THC? Your body will either produce endocannabinoids or use the THC. These cannabinoids will bind onto CB1 receptors on the axon terminals of the feedback fibers and stop the feedback cells from firing. Since the connection between the feedback fibers and the granule cells are excitatory, the feedback fibers will not fire onto the granule cells, so the granule cells won't react. Since the granule cells won't react, the inhibitory effects of the granule cells are reduced, so now the mitral cells are free to fire away. So when you smell food, your odor receptors will fire onto the mitral cells, which will then fire strongly onto the olfactory tract, which will enhance your hypothalamus and mesolimbic structures. This is why food tastes better.